Now, joining us is Dr. Busby, Christopher Busby. He is a chemical physicist. He's advised BBC. He's advised EU groups. He's a very respected professor, University of Ulster in Northern Ireland. And he joins us today. He's got several websites that publishes peer-reviewed work. You can look at it there. But I have to toot his horn. In fact, having him back on, we had him on quite a bit when it was getting a lot of attention and the public would actually listen. Day one, he said, we have these isotope readings. This shows there's been meltdown. Those are reactor rods being blown in the sky. This is a cover-up. This is much worse than Chernobyl. And we got criticism when he was on. People said, oh, this is fear-mongering. It couldn't be true. Months after, once it wasn't in the news, their own top scientists went public, resigned. Leaders of Japan resigned. They covered it up. There's been an exodus out of central Japan to the south. Even though the government says it's safe, the public isn't stupid. There's been reported deaths associated with radiation poisoning. The Fukushima 50 who went in. And now it's just out of sight, out of mind. So giving us a report, as we prepare to leave this disastrous year, 2011, and I'll pull up the date, exactly how long ago Fukushima was in a moment, is Dr. Busby to recap what happened and then to explain to us what he thinks may be going on with all these new disasters and where he sees this going in the future. Dr. Busby, thank you for joining us.
Yes, hello, Alex. Hi. Okay, well, I think that people in the future, looking back at this event in Japan, will recognize that this is probably one of the most serious public health accidents, if you like, that in the history of the human race. The huge amounts of radioactivity were released and still contaminate very large parts of northern Japan. And there has been a probe recently by the Japanese government into what happened. And I have to say that the probe found that all of my predictions right back at the beginning when I was on the BBC and ITN just after the accident, the catastrophe occurred, all of my predictions were shown to be accurate. Although at the time everyone was saying, like you said, this is just scaremongering, the guy's wrong, he's making it up and so on. I have to say also that nobody's apologized to me about any of this, and there's been a deathly hush about these effects, and we learn very little about what's really happening at the reactors even now. The wrong questions are being asked, and no answers are forthcoming.
And then we get Twilight Zone comments by people in the London Guardian saying, oh, I'm now for nuclear power because of Fukushima. It's so wondrous. And I mean, it's so bizarre.
Yes, well, that guy, George Monbiot, he actually took it into his head to attack me personally from the columns of The Guardian 2 weeks running and raked out an awful lot of scurrilous nonsense and lies and so on about me personally. I was quite irritated by all of that, and there's not much I can do about it. And the Guardian newspaper have refused to, they haven't allowed me to make any sort of response. So it seemed to me that this was part of a general operation that's taking place worldwide to try and push nuclear as an option to solve all of the problems relating to the energy supply to modern civilization. But my concern about all this is that the modern civilization that they're trying to fuel is something that is very bad for the people who live within it. It's actually killing people. The system itself, which is something that you talk about a lot. But I'm absolutely with you there. The system itself is not sustainable. It just absolutely isn't, and something has to be done. Not just about nuclear power, but about the whole economic structure of the system and the power structure within it. Before everybody in the world, just doesn't survive. It's quite terrifying.
Well, I mean, here's an example. 30 years ago, and I've talked to top economists on this subject, the U.S. and British governments and others gave out pretty accurate economic numbers on unemployment, on inflation. Now they just put out completely fake numbers. They say unemployment's 8.9, it's really 22 plus. They say inflation's 3%, it's really 11 or more. And I mean, it's almost a insanity by the ruling class now, where their children are breathing this radiation. And I mean, in Chernobyl in '86, they made a real effort, as you know, to keep people from eating the food and drinking the milk for at least 6 months to mitigate some of it. Now there's not even an attempt.
Yes, that's right. The Soviets, although everyone at the beginning of this Fukushima catastrophe were talking about how it anything like Chernobyl. Actually, the Soviet authorities evacuated people from Chernobyl very quickly, and they really did do their best. What we see here is an almost totally cynical and criminal set of policies which are sacrificing an enormous number of people to a kind of god of nuclear futures. And I'm not quite sure how it happens, because people ask me again and again, they say, how is it that these people don't recognize that they themselves and their children will suffer the consequences of these exposures? But it does seem as if they don't. It seems as if there's some kind of zombification or Sovietization of history in the West now, where the big newspapers, and I include the Guardian, where George Monbiot was writing his pieces, having been converted to nuclear, they seem to have become part of an appalling sort of cover-up system, rather like the worst days of Stalin. It's really hard to know where this is all going.
You've really put a good verbal description of it, of something that is indescribably insane. But breaking down the real history, which they now admit, for those that don't know, because it's been buried, what really happened if we go back to the tsunami, March 11th, almost 10 months ago, 2011, what really happened with those 6 reactors?
Okay, well, as far as we can tell, what happened was this, that there was an enormously powerful earthquake, and that the earthquake caused damage to the reactors before the tsunami hit. And this damage to the reactors cut off the cooling supply to the reactors. And so, of course, they started to melt, they started to boil, and the water boiled away, and then the rods started to melt down. Now, the story is that, in fact, they went into cold shutdown automatically at the time of the earthquake, and then what happened was that the backup generators, the systems that were supposed to continue to provide cooling, were wiped out by the water from the tsunami. It actually really doesn't matter that much which of those is correct, because what then happened was that there were, in my opinion, nuclear explosions and hydrogen explosions, which effectively destroyed most of those reactors in the first week. And we can tell that from levels of radioactivity that were measured in various detectors quite far to the south of Tokyo. You can see the levels of radiation increasing and staying high in the week following, on the Monday following the tsunami. So we know even at that time that the reactors had melted down. But at that time, the International Atomic Energy Agency and TEPCO and the Japanese government were still telling people that there was no problem, that the reactor pressure vessels were intact and so forth. It was clear to me, looking at the video footage on YouTube, and in fact, isn't it interestingly depressing that we have to now get our accurate news from YouTube rather than from the newspapers? But looking at the video footage on YouTube, you could see that the force of the explosion, at least in reactor number 3, was so great that it couldn't possibly be a hydrogen explosion. And at that time, I was saying it was a nuclear explosion like the Chernobyl explosion.
And by the way, I've had people on the show who aren't physicists, and they just say, oh, that's impossible. But I've talked to other physicists, and they say, no, that things can purify out into levels, and that you can get smaller explosions. And here you are, you're an acclaimed physicist. You're saying this can happen, but the media went along with it and said that can't happen.
No, I know they said it couldn't happen, but there was a very famous British physicist who talked about the famous explosion at Kishtim in Chelyabinsk in 1959, which was a similar explosion in a spent fuel pond. And he said that couldn't happen either, but it did happen. And I think the way in which it happens is that when these
Tell you what, stay there. This is riveting. Stay there, Dr. Busby. We'll come back, talk more about Fukushima, what's currently happening there, and then we'll look at all these other disasters. Dr. Busby, you were getting into how nuclear explosions can take place. And, of course, after you first reported this, they did pick up the isotopes that they had to admit only happened during those type of explosions.
Yes, that's right. We still don't know exactly what the concentrations of the isotopes are that would enable us to tell the kind of explosion that occurred. But my point that I would make is this, is that actually you have, in one, at least in the reactor where I think there was a nuclear explosion, you have plutonium and uranium mixed together. Now, if the temperature gets high enough, then what happens is that one of those will distill off at a different temperature and then concentrate at a cooler part of the reactor vessel or the tank that this is contained in. And, of course, it only needs to have a few kilograms of that to form a critical mass, and then you've got an atom bomb. So there's a mechanism that's quite easy to explain. It's exactly like distilling alcohol and water. You're distilling plutonium and uranium, but just at a much higher temperature. And so then when all the alcohol stroke plutonium comes together in one place, bang.
And you've also got explosions going on around it that could be the precursor explosion.
There's an awful lot that we don't know about what goes on in these sort of situations, and I think the fact is that the scientists don't either. And this brings me to a point that I would like to quickly make, which is this, that physicists deal with mathematics, and they reduce the whole world into very simplistic equations which they believe are capable of explaining the world, but actually very often they find that they aren't, because they haven't put something in the equation that they didn't think of.
Chaos theory.
Well, all sorts, absolutely, all sorts of stuff. I mean, just remember that physicists have lost 95% of the universe. They call it dark matter. They don't know what it is. So whether we should believe physicists or not when they talk to us about nuclear power stations and all their calculations is a very interesting question.
Well, they've proven from
what there is in the universe.
Sure, as you know, Doctor, there's now been Nobel Prizes handed out proving that when you have these black holes, you have these quasars, you have these exploding suns, that they're finding that the energy isn't there for that and that it is dark matter.
Exactly so, but dark matter is a bit like just invoking a demon, you know. You put together a whole load of equations and you say this will give us the answer, and you find it only gives you 5% of the answer. You say, well, the rest of it is a demon. Well, I know you call it dark matter, but it's not a lot different from Holy Mother Church at the time of Galileo, as far as I can see.
Yeah, man has got a lot of high-tech technologies, but doesn't even understand most of what's connected to it.
I think that's true. I think that the last century was the century of the physicists, and it's about time we moved away from that and realized that physics is a very powerful tool, but it's a very reductionist tool, and it's about time that people started to think for themselves and that they stopped believing in this sort of magical idea that the physicist knows what he's talking about, because generally speaking he doesn't. And in the case of radiation and health, which was my area, he certainly doesn't, because lots of people are going to die as a result of Fukushima, and at the moment they're saying nobody is.
Well, I've seen reports in Japan, though, that people are dying, but who worked there, but they're always saying something else did it.
Of course, that's what they will say. It's exactly what they said with Chernobyl. We've just had a book, incidentally, which I hope to plug. It's called Fukushima and Health, What to Expect. And it's based entirely upon the research that was done after Chernobyl. So we kind of know what's going to happen at Fukushima. And it's already happening. I get emails regularly telling me that people are just dropping dead. You know, school children are dropping dead. 1 minute they're there, and then their heart stops and they fall down dead. And this is exactly what we found in Chernobyl, because the cesium gets into the heart muscle and it destroys heart muscle. And when a certain amount of heart muscle is gone, the heart is no longer viable. And then you get a heart attack and die.
Incredible. You know, I wanted to get you back on to give us the latest on Fukushima. I didn't even know you had a book out, but when we come back from break, please, I want people to get it and read it and pass it on to friends, so we'll definitely talk about the book when we come back. We're about to go to break, but what's the latest? Because they're claiming that they've stabilized Fukushima, but we've heard this quite a bit in the last 9 months.
Well, I think this is discourse manipulation. I mean, stabilized means that it's not any worse than it was when they stabilized it. But if by that they're somehow saying it's safe, they're wrong. I mean, we know that the xenon isotopes are coming out in the last month that show that very short half-life isotopes that show that it's continuing to fission. And I think it's pretty certain that the fuel is molten and it's gone through the reactor pressure vessel and it's in the ground. And Russia today are telling me that there are big cracks in the ground and steam is coming out and so on. So we're talking about a very serious situation which they're just trying to downplay because they want to limit the damage that it's going to cause to the development of nuclear power worldwide.
Well, all I know is they've got a history of covering this stuff up, and it's not safe.
Well, you're right there. You're right there. And it's continuing, that history.
Well, and I wouldn't all just blame it on physicists. I mean, obviously, you're a physicist, so you can talk about your own discipline. But look, 25 years ago, they said never use DU in war. It's deadly. It blows back. It's a soft kill weapon, a delayed kill. You can't use it. And in 91, they just said, we're going to use it. And now they just say it's good for the troops. We'll be right back.